Welcome back to Stir Crazy, boys and girls, where we all have had a case of the Mondays ever since we've been in quarantine, these several weeks now. It's episode 36. And on today's show, we're going to be discussing the economy, but not in a boring, goofy way, in a way that you, and more importantly, I understand. Okay. I'm your host, Kim Brown. On today's program, gang, every part of the economy affects every single one of you watching. So this is a conversation that you definitely want to pay close attention to. I mean, is there more room for the economy to fall? Have we already reached the bottom? Are we already in a rebound at this point? Are more people going to lose their jobs? What are we going to do about these draconian budget cuts that some states are already implementing to not only needed programs like Medicare and Medicaid, but also to education cuts at a time of distance learning where nearly a quarter of students don't have access to internet. I mean, stuff is already on the chopping block right now, okay? So important to have this discussion. We're looking at record high unemployment, tens of millions without health care, and then interest rates at zero. Could they be cut below zero? What does that even mean? Okay, we're going to get into quite a bit of this today. So listen, as always, we want you to be part of the conversation. We want you to join us in the comments and down in the chat. You guys always have excellent observations and really salient points. I think we have probably the smartest online YouTube audience across the web. So yes, come on back, babies. We want to hear from you. But now it's time to introduce our fantastic panel. Today we are joined with Economic Update host and founder of Democracy at Work, economist Richard Wolff. Also, PERI Gender and Care Work Program economist Katherine Moos, and the incoming executive director here at The Real News, John Duda. Gang, thank you all so much for being here. And John, welcome to you especially. New boss, is really nice to see you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So the first place we're going to start is whether or not that we have reached the bottom of the free fall, so to speak. We are at over 30 million unemployed. That number continues to rise. Many people feel as if those numbers are being undercounted, that we could approach somewhere between 20 and 25% unemployment. You know, these are historical numbers. And Richard, I want to go to you first, because the interesting thing to me about economists, you doubly serve as like historians, because you have to study, past economic cycles, ups and downs. And when it comes to these types of figures, especially when it comes to unemployment, we've only seen this a couple of times in American history. So tell us exactly what we are dealing with in context, if you could.
Sure. The greatest crash of capitalism still is the 1930s, the crash that starts in 1929, and that reaches its peak in terms of unemployment at an official 25% rate in 1933. That's been the benchmark of horror when it comes to unemployment here in the United States. So we can say at this moment that we are now, at the very least, in the number two in the second worst crash unemployment in American history. We thought we had gotten to number two back in 2008, all those many years ago, but no, we're doing worse now than we did in 2008. I think anyone who claims to know that we've reached the bottom is one of those people you should stop talking to and go find somebody else, because we don't know, and anyone who claims to know is somebody you should talk to. So you should stop talking to. So it's the benchmark. Nobody knows how each of these shocks of unemployment works out. The damage lasts a long time. We know that for years afterwards. People's educations are interrupted. People's ability to stay in their homes are interrupted. They're forced to move. They lose jobs. People have to understand many of the jobs that people are now unemployed for have disappeared or will disappear in the weeks ahead, so that you don't even know that you can go back and get the job you once had or what that then will mean. You mentioned correctly that Many of our people's health insurance for their family is associated with their job. If you lose your job, well, then you often also lose your health insurance, if not right away, then within a few weeks or months. No one knows quite what that implies. If you lose your job and you're unemployed, you lose often a connection with your technology that may be different when you get back. I mean, the open-ended disaster that it represents is why societies have tried. Capitalist economies for the last 300 years have tried desperately to come up with some way to make this system less prone to these crashes. But the reality is, wherever capitalism has settled for 300 years, on average, it has an economic downturn every 4 to 7 years, everywhere. Some of them are short and shallow, others of them are long and deep. This one is the long and deep variety. We are now 20 years into this new century. We had a crash, the dot-com crash in 2000. We had the subprime mortgage in 2008. We have the coronavirus now. That's 3 and 20 years. There it is, just a little below the 4 to 7 year average. This is a volatile, unstable system. Even if I could, and I can't, tell you that this is the bottom, I'm unfortunately forced to also tell you, unless I'm a charlatan, that the way we've handled this crisis, just like we threw money in 2000 and again at 2008, one thing is certain, we're already building to the next one.
Hmm. Richard, when you describe the last 20 years, you're basically describing my entire adult life right there. So, whoo, that was depressing. Katherine, I'm curious, as an economist, you guys study data, study numbers. If you had to look back at past economic recessions/depressions, what numbers indicate that it is getting better or worse? And I don't mean necessarily the stock market, because on today, we saw the stock market rally upwards of nearly 1,000 points after Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell gave an interview with 60 Minutes where, he said some reassuring things. And then there was some news today about some potential hope for a vaccine available maybe at the end of this year, early next year. So the market rallied. I mean, that doesn't really mean anything for somebody like me who has zero money in the stock market. So I don't care if the stock market rallies. But when you're looking at numbers, what will tell you that this thing is getting better or worse?
Right. So as you point out, the stock market is used, especially by the media, as a way to tell people how the economy is doing. But it really doesn't tell you anything about how most workers are doing. It really doesn't. Most workers are concerned about jobs and concerned about wages. So we would look for job growth, and we would look for lower unemployment, which I don't foresee happening in the next job report. I think we'll see actually a higher level of unemployment than was previously announced at 14.7%. And we'd also look for wage growth, which I also don't expect. So I think what Professor Wolff was describing is that this coronavirus has hit an already very fragile host in the sense that we have a number of many low-wage jobs in our economy. We've had wage stagnation for the last 40 years, and we've had an erosion of employer-based benefits, which are, of course, most importantly, healthcare tied to employment for many people. And so this has created a very insecure economy for many U.S. workers. So I don't think we'll see a recovery until we see some really big structural reforms, which unfortunately have not been a part of any of the stimulus spending.
That's an excellent point, Katherine. And John, I wanted to ask, how much of America's lack of a true social safety net is impacting how bad this economic recession eventually gets?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's pretty dismal to see what happens in this crisis. This crisis is kind of like a stress test, right? It hits, it disrupts everything, and then you see what the systems were, and you see what they're designed to handle. And you see, for instance, that we have an unemployment insurance system, which is basically designed to discourage people from using the benefits. We've seen this like really dramatically in Florida, where the system was basically built to be non-functional. And we see this across the board, right? We see this in our healthcare system, right? I mean, that was just months ago, right? That the Democratic Party, the ostensible opposition party, the party that's supposed to be representing, the interests of common people against the commanding heights of the economy, is having this big debate about health insurance, and most of the candidates leaning towards the center land on this idea that if you like your health insurance, you should be able to keep it. And it's just been exposed as a brutal lie by this crisis, right? With the amount of people being thrown out of work, we see that the cobbled together safety net that has been in place in this country is really failing millions and millions of people in really incredibly brutal ways. And those, that's going to have shocks that are going to, propagate forward through the economy. Damage done to families, damage done to people's mental states, to people's health, to people's educational process. All of that is going to continue to all of this is just going to continue to rack up more and more damage and dig this hole deeper and deeper.
Mm. So Sunday night, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell appeared on 60 Minutes, and this is what he had to say.
People who are getting hurt the worst are the most recently hired, the lowest paid people. It's women to an extraordinary extent. Of the people who were working in February, who were making less than $40,000 per year, almost 40% have lost their jobs in the last month or so.
The people who can afford it the least are being hurt the worst.
That's right. The pain is very widely spread, but clearly it is falling the most on those who are least in a position to bear it.
Richard, I wanted to ask, because you raised a point earlier about how some of these jobs are just not coming back. And you went through these, in recent times, these economic recessions that we've had. You referenced 2000, the dot-com bubble, 08, the Great Recession, and here we are now. And it seems like I've heard this so many times that there were American jobs that just aren't coming back. 20, 25 years ago, there were manufacturing jobs that were here and they're not coming back. And now a lot of these service industry jobs were here and they're also not coming back. I mean, this economy is based so much on consumption and not so much on manufacturing and producing things. We're encouraged to spend and not save. This has long seemed untenable, but now it seems, oh no, this is untenable for real.
Yeah, I must say, I was struck by Fed Chairman Powell's way of articulating this stunning fact that of the people earning under $40,000 a year, 40% have lost their jobs. That's the capitalist system. That's not some mystery. That's not some natural occurrence that we have to wonder about. This is the way this system works. It distributes the pain of a virus we didn't prepare for onto the people who had very little decision-making power over that lack of preparedness. They're not the ones at fault, but they're the ones being punished because this is a system, the way capitalism organizes things, that those with the power and the money are able to push the burdens of whatever happens onto those less capable of doing that. And so, my son once told me that he went to work in a place where the philosophy was kick down, suck up. That's how you make it in that company. And I think the whole economy is organized this way, and that we're seeing that this is a system that has no commitment, not only to dealing with, say, inequality, so it doesn't help to produce these kinds of crashes, which it does, but even to allow during the crash the inequality to become worse. The very thing that you have to face as a cause is being prepared to be the cause of the next collapse when you have the same reduced consumption capability of the mass of people because of their incomes, because of the savings, if they had any, that they're using up now. All of it is of a piece of a system that has become so dysfunctional for the mass of the people, as is revealed, as John says, you see the stresses, that you're beginning to get to the point, which I didn't think I would see in my lifetime, that capitalism is becoming itself its own worst enemy.
Amazing. We're getting a lot of comments already. Thank you guys, everyone in the chat and in the comments. You're getting it cracking early. Schultzy 100, friend of the show, he says, exactly, or they say, I'm not really sure about Schultzy, but it's cool. Exactly. The news anchors or our politicians will point to the market as if it's some holy metric for the common man or woman to determine their futures. Yeah, I've always seen like stuff about the investors are worried. I don't give a shit about what investors are worried about. I've never been an investor. I'm probably never going to be an investor. The stock market, rises and falls based off the feelings of rich people, which is an amazing thing to be highlighted on the news every single night. But Catherine, as we're dealing with this economic news about 40% of people earning $40,000 or less, those jobs have just evaporated at this point. What industries are going to be the ones to possibly survive this pandemic and the subsequent economic devastation that we're dealing with right now?
I mean, I think that's still an open question in many ways. I think what we're seeing is that the economy being so service sector oriented is very vulnerable to this kind of thing. What actually survives, I think we're seeing the platform economies taking, it's a huge boon to them that we're doing everything online. But I actually wanted to say one more thing, sort of in response to what Fed Chairman Powell was mentioning in terms of inequality, and also mentioning the women have lost a lot of jobs, and part of that is because of the structure of our labor market and how women are segmented into certain kinds of jobs. So women make up about 69% of low-wage workers, 72% of healthcare workers, which amazingly to many of us, the healthcare sector has seen enormous layoffs during this recession, because people aren't going to the doctor for either routine checkups or for elective surgeries, and so they're laying off lots of workers. 67% of grocery store workers are women, and so that is why 60% of jobs lost have been women. Another issue around inequality. I mean, I'm heartened in some ways to see the Chairman Powell talk about this in these terms, but he doesn't mention any of the racial aspects of this, where Black and Brown communities are disproportionately affected, both for the health outcomes of the coronavirus as well as the economic outcomes, and that there's some estimates that Black unemployment rate will rise to 40% or so. So I just wanted to mention there's a lot that's sort of missing from the chairman's analysis of how this is disproportionately affecting different people.
Excellent point. Thank you so much for pointing that out. John Duda, your thoughts about what Jerome Powell had to say? He also made some other comments during the 60 Minutes interview where he said, don't count out the American economy. And of course, I don't really expect him to say anything else but, right? Because Fed chairman's words are analyzed and scrutinized by people across the globe. So clearly he's not going to say, oh no, the shit is real bad. That's not part of his talking points, right?
Yeah, I think it was interesting listening to his remarks, and specifically, he kept coming back to why this is different than the crisis in 2008 or the crisis in 29. And his excuse was, well, this is an exogenous shock, right? This is something that's come from the outside. It's like a natural disaster. It has nothing to do with the fundamentals of our economy, which, according to Jerome Powell, are completely sound. And I look at that statistic that he offered, right? 40% of people making $40,000 or less. And on the one hand, yeah, those 40% of people who are out of their jobs is that's a tragedy. That's an emergency, right? But then I look at that the number of $40,000 or less a year. I was doing some back of the napkin calculations before this, and when you look at where the minimum wage should have been, should it have kept up with inflation, it's about $40,000 a year, right? So the scandal here is that we have an incredible crisis unfolding, yes, but it's unfolding in the context of an economy that was already broken and deeply unequal, and just brutally extracting money from working people and concentrating it up at the top.
If I could add something, Kim, to what John just said and what you asked, I find it, I'm trying to be polite here. I find it troubling. I'll be careful. Troubling that we blame these crises, every 4 to 7 years, on something exogenous. In 2000, it was the dot-com crisis. In 2008, it was the subprime mortgage crisis. And now we're blaming a virus. Let me remind everyone, the dot-com crisis had something to do with a few companies in high tech whose prices on the stock market were out of control. That's not the first time this has happened. This has happened many times. It didn't always cause a crisis. So blaming the trigger for what happens after the trigger goes off is a little bizarre. The fact that significant numbers of people couldn't make their mortgage payments, that's not new either. That's not what caused the crisis. That's the precipitating event, but it isn't the explanation. And if the 4 to 7 year average is what it is, then we were due for a collapse, which, by the way, the financial press has been predicting for at least the last 18 months. And if it hadn't been the corona, it would have been something else. We have a system that is unstable. That may be difficult to face. But my guess is that if you lived with someone as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago.
Very valid. From the comments, Thea Napper says they're trying and failing to come up with ways to help people that won't be considered socialism. I hate this country sometimes because, we cling so hard to capitalism, but when it's time, when everything falls apart, as Richard said, every 4 to 7 years, we've had it happen 3-ish times now in the past 20 years. Corporations line up with their hands out for the socialism, and Congress doesn't even bat an eye. What you need? $2 trillion? Psst, we had that for you next week, champ. And nothing wrong with that. Also from the comments, John Custer says, with zero interest rates for financial markets, trillions of dollars created to stabilize the market, what is the real value of American money? The stock market is the scoreboard for the elite. What are you guys' thoughts about that?
I'll start. I won't repeat what everybody seems to understand, which is true, that the stock market is not totally disconnected from what goes on in production and distribution, but the linkages are further and further attenuated in recent years for all kinds of reasons. Nowadays, with this rushing to solve every problem by heaving money mostly at banks, insurance companies, and large corporations, which is what we've been doing over and over again, only the quantity gets larger more than anything else. Here's the joke. You're not going to see that money go into production of goods and services because we don't have the capacity to buy it. We don't raise the wages. Katherine made that point a while ago. Real wages have gone nowhere. People responded to that by borrowing record amounts of money starting in the 80s and 90s, and now they're tapped out. That's part of why we crashed in 2008. People could not sustain the debts they had already accumulated. So we have a population that can't buy. So the money that they're pumping in is not going to go to produce what can't be sold. So where's all the money going to go to? Where's all that inflation that money normally creates? Well, it's doing its job. It's inflating. But what it's inflating is the stock market. That's where you can now borrow money at no interest rate and go in and buy, sell it again in a few weeks or months, at a higher price to the next person who's playing exactly the same game that you're playing. So it's a self-validating bubble, which lasts really nicely until it doesn't. And then we have the crash again. This is a system. Well, let me put it this way. When you listen to politicians, left and right, telling you about how they're working hard to get us back to normal, which means, because they explain it, to get back to where we were before the coronavirus hit. This is like inviting you to get back onto the train we know was heading down the track right into a brick wall. We don't want to go back to normal. Normal is what got us here.
And a question for the panel, and Katherine and John, you guys feel free to jump in here as well. 206 War Eagle, another friend of the show, says, what is the panel's opinion of the petrodollar collapse? If our economy can't get oil back into the plus, in the positive, I guess he means back into the black, and the Fed gets its negative rates, et cetera, but the people are growing, harvesting, building, and et cetera. So what do you got? What's y'all's take on the oil collapse and the price of oil and the fact that we are in a glut, and then there's like this battle raging with like OPEC and like Russia, all these, external foreign forces that I don't quite understand on the market. But all I know is that gas prices are looking like 1998 again. Very nice, but too bad no one's driving anywhere because we're all quarantined and should be social distancing. So, gang, what is your take on how the collapse in oil prices, how that is adding another layer onto all of this?
I think it's generating a lot of demands for a bailout of the fossil fuel sector, which we know we actually have to shut down over the next decade or so, right? If we had an ambitious left opposition that was able to come into power, this would actually be a fantastic opportunity. You could buy out the sector and shut it down. It's not making anybody any money anyway. These assets are basically, becoming worthless of their own accord. Unfortunately, we don't really have an opposition that's really up to the challenge, as far as I can tell. I think people in general are just far more excited about radical solutions to the economic crisis, the long economic crisis that we're living through, than the political leadership in the mainstream of the Democratic Party. Like, to give you an example, last year I polled people on whether in the next crisis we should bail out the banks to save the economy, right? Funnel trillions of dollars at them, no strings attached, just because we have to save the economy, or whether we should take those banks that failed and convert them to public ownership and operate them as public utilities. The answers were amazing. About 19% of people were in favor of the idea of just bailing out the banks again. 53% of people were like, no, let's convert them to public utilities, right? Let's make these things publicly owned. If we have to funnel trillions of dollars into them, we may as well own them. That is the kind of solution that we need. And that's the kind of solution that could have broad support if it was posed as a matter of a common sense approach to really important problems that we need to address. And that's exactly the kind of solution that seems to be off the table when you look at the kind of compromises that are emerging, even within the Democratic Party, which I think is really, really unfortunate.
Yeah, nobody's in favor of nationalizing anything. Like all this money we just gave to the airline industry, oil and gas is probably going to line up with their hands out. I mean, Katherine, what do we get out of this $3 trillion of taxpayer money that is being allocated to all these very wealthy industries who, by the way, clearly failed to plan for a situation just like this? I had to laugh when the airline industry lined up for a bailout. I'm like, so are y'all still going to charge me $50 a bag? Or what do I get out of this exactly?
Yeah, I think John makes a great point about this being a great argument for some sort of Green New Deal at this moment, where there is a lot of political support on the left, but there's huge resistance in Congress. And even when oil and gas companies are not doing well, they still exert huge influence. And that's true also, I think, of the auto industry. In terms of what we get out of these stimulus measures, it's really an interesting question. I mean, in the CARES Act, for example, was amounted to about $2 trillion, which is a lot of money. But keep in mind that the Trump tax cuts were $2.3 trillion. So we've done this kind of this sort of social spending before. And recently, but prior to this, it was in the form of tax reform. There was a lot of important and needed spending. People got direct payments. The direct payments that people got of up to $1,200 per individual, should not be confused with the universal basic income. They were essentially a tax rebate, which is one of the sort of favorite neoliberal policy tools of the last several decades. That doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to give people money, but it certainly doesn't create any kind of underlying reform. And these public investments, or this public spending, really didn't create a lot of public investments. It didn't create investments in long-term public health infrastructure or public health insurance coverage. This is, I think, a great moment to be seriously arguing for Medicare for all. I think there's sort of no more obvious time that we need single payer health insurance provided by the government than during a recession during a recession and a pandemic where people are losing their health insurance coverage. It makes absolutely no sense. It's not moral, and it doesn't make any economic sense. But the truth is that there's been huge resistance to that. So even though they put a lot of money into, unemployment insurance and a number of other social aspects, as well as big handouts for corporations, we don't see these sort of deeper structural reforms. The other point I wanted to make is that a lot of people were excluded from this spending. So immigrants being the most obvious group, even households with immigrants that may be mixed status households, as a lot of households are. And that's sort of another really obvious consequence of having an administration that is really hell-bent on xenophobic and white nationalist objectives.
Gang,
if I could add a little bit about the petroleum, the oil, people should understand that the current situation starts with the fracking business. The effort to draw the United States to get at the oil that you can get at with the new technology, putting aside for a moment the assault on Native Americans' religion and rights, and putting aside the ecological horror of it all. The gambit there was another bit of capitalism. It was the effort to make the United States self-sufficient by producing oil and making it profitable. It got the support of the business community and the leadership of the country. The frackers, the oil companies, went and got enormous loans by pitching to the banks the money that could be made. And it was all premised on the price of oil being $60 to $100 an hour, $60 to $100 per barrel. And the only way that you could add all that oil to the world market at that price would be if the other major producers like Saudi Arabia, Russia, and so on, produced less. Otherwise, the fracking oil would be added and it would drive down the price and thereby undercut the profitability and threaten the banks who had lent all the money. But it was crazy to believe that the United States could force the rest of the world simply to absorb all of this extra oil and to cut their own production, which these countries depend on. So it was only a matter of time before this absurdity would blow up. And as the United States loses its global power, bit by bit, relentlessly, year by year, it was only 3 or 4 years later, namely now, that Russia and Saudi Arabia basically said, we're not doing this. We're not going to reduce our production to enable you Americans to take our market, because that's what it is. So they didn't. So the price of oil collapsed to $10 to $20 a barrel. At that point, the frackers in the United States go bankrupt. And the banks that lent them too much money go bankrupt with them. That's what this is all about. Mr. Trump is having to work to try to manipulate and threaten both the Saudis and the Russians to get them to cooperate here, which means in the middle of a pandemic and the worst crisis in a century, the President of the United States is working hard to raise the price of gas at the pump. And no amount of futzing around with PR the way he does will keep that a secret very much longer, and will only make, by the way, the cost of our heating oil, our fertilizers, everything else that comes from oil will become more expensive at the worst possible moment in the business cycle of this unstable capitalism. I mean, I hate to be the bearer of unpleasant analytics, but that's not my fault. I'm just a messenger. I'm telling you how it works in order that we can maybe get to the point that I think all of us agree that this is a system that has run out of its historical justification.
I really hope that is the case, Richard, but I know that so many people
You and me both.
But unfortunately, it's poor people who are going to suffer hardest and first. Yep. Women are going to suffer hardest and first. Black and brown people are going to suffer hardest and first. And meanwhile, those living in the positive part of this new gilded age, are just consolidating wealth and hoarding resources, and they're going to be fine. And the rest of us, I don't know what this looks like for the rest of us. But speaking of the rest of us, gang, I mean, we are seeing the COVID-19 infections go down in some places. Other places are starting to flare up. There's not really a consensus on whether or not nationally the curve is being flattened. But as Dr. Anthony Fauci and other public health officials have said, that we can certainly expect at minimum a second wave of coronavirus to return this fall into winter. And one of Trump's top economic advisors, Larry Kudlow, can y'all believe he hired that jackass at the White House? Like, Larry Kudlow has a position with the U.S. government. This is shocking. And I know he's not been a new person there, but every time I see him and him being referenced as one of Trump's top economic advisors to the White House, I'll just roll my eyes. But anyway, in a recent interview, he said that he does not expect for the government, or rather for businesses in the United States, to shut down again if there is a second eruption or even third eruption of the coronavirus. And the reasons that he gave is because he says that we have a lot more experience now, or he was referencing a conversation that he had with a senior member at the White House, that our experience with this is a lot better. So we should be able to withstand a reinfection of sorts. We are still learning about this virus. We don't know exactly how this virus mutates. From all indications, it's a very good possibility that once you've had coronavirus, yes, you can become reinfected with coronavirus. It is striking children in ways that weren't thought of, I guess, at the onset of the pandemic. So, Katherine, I wanted to start with you, because if businesses don't shut down, or if the country doesn't shut down, if we have another spike in infections, I don't really know what that portends. That doesn't seem like a good thing. It just seems as though we're setting up our medical professionals for failure again, if we're not necessarily prepared, because we weren't prepared the first time. So I don't necessarily have the full faith and confidence in the Trump administration that we will be ready a second or third time either.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two interpretations, and it could be a combination. One is that this is just a sort of delusional attitude that we'll be able to not have more shutdowns when there's a second wave in the fall and winter. The other, I think, is that this is a really Malthusian attitude. This idea from the classical political economist Malthus, that benign neglect, which would just sort of let people die off, which we've already heard. We've heard some politicians say, I think the lieutenant governor of Texas and some others very, very famously saying that we'll just sort of let older people die. I mean, that's essentially what they're saying. If they're saying there won't be shutdowns, is they're just accepting that there's going to be huge casualties in terms of people's lives. The other is that they're just sort of posturing that there won't be shutdowns and that there really will. I think it's hard to say.
It is always striking to me that a country that likes to talk about family values, the sanctity of human life, and all of that, and find fault with other countries for insufficiently valuing, is now glibly talking about trade-offs, this bizarre phrase in economics, in which we weigh human life against other things and find that the other things are more important quite often to human life. And so a bunch of people will die in the tens or hundreds of thousands. It's extraordinary to me what that tells you about where a society is on the downswing.
John, did you want to hop in there?
Yeah, I think what's most distressing to me is the way this kind of politics of like, yeah, we're just going to open up and, we'll just get through it and see what happens. The way that intersects with the way this disease is actually behaving and the industries in which this disease is taking the most lives. I was looking at the statistics from Texas, right? Texas reopened, and what's happening? Well, there's a big spike in cases, right? Well, where's the big spike of cases? The big spike in cases, part of it is in a meatpacking facility outside of Amarillo, right, where you've got a huge increase in cases. And so you have labor, which is, incredibly racialized, right? Incredibly precarious, incredibly policed and repressive, in brutal conditions, right? That these are the industries where people are going to die. And I think for the politicians that are making these decisions, for the astroturfed, reopened protesters that are, demanding they get to go to their barber again and all of this bullshit. I think that, it's really just a profoundly, like, it's not even like the statistical callousness of it. It's that they are aware that the victims of this disease will not be them. The victims of this disease are going to be the people that they're going to work to death, right, or warehouse to death in prisons. And in some ways, it's like capitalism is testing, right? It's trying to see how much expendability can we get away with, right? How many people can we actually just sacrifice to this machine? And as long as those people are the black and brown people who are working in the meatpacking plant, who are invisible to the, the gleaming downtown or the halls of policymaking, then, my fear is that a lot of people are going to be fine with a pretty high rate of sacrifice. And that is distressing. This is an inhuman system. And it's at the time when, what you want to do about a system like this? You want to come out into the streets and demand that it shut down, right? And that's exactly what we can't do. So that's a pretty depressing place.
I would disagree with you there, John Duda, because the reopen the economy people took to the streets, and look, the economy's reopening. It's amazing what a group of angry white folks armed to the teeth can get accomplished. I do stand. I wanted to ask y'all, well, first of all, I wanted to play a clip because in these trying financial times, sometimes the response economically from the government and policymakers is one of austerity. And in some states, we're already beginning to see the indications and just proposals, basically, of governors letting us know that they intend to cut a lot of money because they are losing a lot of money from tax revenue, et cetera. So this is coming from, this clip we're about to see is from Ohio. Let's take a look at that.
Governor Mike DeWine in his daily briefing said these cuts are significant and very difficult to make. We want to get right to the cuts and the breakdown of them. Over 2 months, a total of $775 million will be slashed from the state budget. Here is how it's breaking down. Medicaid will lose $210 million, K through 12 foundation payment reduction of $300 million, other education budget line items $55 million, higher education $110 million, and all other agencies $100 million. The governor said he's trying to preserve basic services and not tap into the rainy day fund just yet.
This rain is not a passing spring shower. It could be, we don't really know, but could be a long, cold, lingering storm. We should not use that rainy day funding until we have to.
The governor went on to say that all agencies, including his office, will sustain cuts. There's one exception, though, and that is no cuts to the prison system.
No cuts to the prison system, gang. Hey, but guess what? $200 million for Medicaid in the time of a pandemic as it rages across the country. Oh, yeah, we can cut $200 million from a health social safety net as people are losing their jobs and losing access to health insurance. I mean, Richard, can you believe the audacity? And I know Ohio's not going to be an isolated case here. We're probably going to see this happen nationwide. And part of this stems from Congress, well, rather, I should say Senate Republicans and the White House, just flat out saying that the states will not be getting any more federal aid from us unless certain conditions are met, primarily liability protections in place for businesses. That's the big thing Mitch McConnell has been pushing. But I wanted to get your reaction to these cuts that Governor Mike DeWine of Ohio is about to make. No cuts to the prison industry. I thought that was interesting.
Let me jump in here and tell you all a story in case you hadn't heard about it, to show you the implications of what is being done in Ohio. Only my story is about New Orleans, Louisiana. Last week, a remarkable thing happened. New Orleans organizes garbage collection by contracting out to another company that does it. And that company, in turn, contracts with a temp agency so that the people collecting garbage in New Orleans are actually temp workers. They get paid the lordly sum of $10.25 an hour. Last week, after fruitless negotiations, they went on strike. They had basically two demands. One, they wanted their pay increased from $10.25 to $15 an hour as hazard pay because garbage is at risk of carrying the coronavirus. And secondly, they wanted a protection for themselves so that they wouldn't get the virus when they handled tons and tons of garbage. The response of the city of New Orleans was to fire all of them and to replace them, get ready, with inmates from a prison in next door Livingston Parish, who are paid $1.33 an hour and who are now collecting the garbage that is at risk of corona. Now, this is called in other countries, this sort of behavior, it's called slave labor. Nor is it to be lost on anyone that the people who lost their jobs were mostly Black, and the inmates who replaced them were also mostly Black. What a statement. The cutting of the money to cities and states when you're giving money hand over fist to all kinds of other players in the economy has no rationale. It can't have anything to do with stimulus, since what cities and towns have to spend, we know they will spend as fast as we give it to them, especially under current conditions when the other revenues are falling apart. So here's my guess based on how capitalism in America has worked. Long-time objective of conservatives, of the business community, and of the Republican Party has to gut pensions, public pensions for public employees, partly to drive down the pensions for everybody else, and partly to make sure that cities and states don't get tempted to raise taxes to pay the pensions that they've promised their workers for their lifetimes. And so here is now the excuse. We're going to have to cut drastically in all the basic services we need, or we'll cut the pensions. And you'll see the game being played over the months ahead to move it to the pensions with the excuse of the kinds of drama that governor of Ohio just displayed.
Katherine or John, you guys feel free to hop in here. Austerity, are we headed in that direction, or are we already there?
Well, I think it's just a terrible, terrible solution to cut Medicaid and education in any context. But I think it's pretty stunning that prisons are not going to have any cuts. I think now is a very good time for criminal justice reform, and particularly knowing how vulnerable institutionalized people are to infection. So I think, Professor Wolff makes a very good, important point about prison labor being used to replace free labor or previous jobs. But I think that it's pretty stunning what's happening in Ohio, and the fact that the governor's not willing to tap into the rainy day fund, I think, is also pretty shameful. I don't think that there's a better time than now for states to draw on their reserves. But of course, this is all made worse by the federal government, or at least Republicans in Congress, making it pretty clear that they don't want to bail out states, which is going to force them, because states can't run a budget deficit. It's going to force them to make all kinds of cuts, which will undoubtedly affect education and healthcare in many cases, because those are often some of the largest parts of the budget, especially in states that have already cut down things, whittled things away. That really only leaves a few places, and they're often not going to do it for prisons or for police or other kinds of spending like that.
Yeah, that's what pisses me off. I mean, one of the biggest wastes of money in Baltimore City is that of the Baltimore City Police Department, which gobbles up a lion's share of the city's budget. And that's just one example. But police eat up a lot of money in state budgets, John Duda, as do the prison systems. But yet, when it comes to kids and health, oh no. Those are things that we can't save those by any means. And every time I hear the word austerity, John, I automatically defer back to Greece and how how much the Greek people stood up in opposition to these austerity cuts from the European Union, and how that it shifted how their society operated to a certain degree.
Yeah, and in many ways, Greece is stuck in a position with respect to the European Union, much like most American states are stuck with respect to the federal government, in terms of not being able to have access to the tools that would allow them to spend the money they need to in order to provide for the needs of their citizens and get their economy back on track. And in Greece, this was brutal, and there was a tremendous wave of popular uprising, agitation, development of alternatives, and ultimately was channeled into a pretty ineffective, ultimately center-left government, which I think was a real disappointment for a lot of people that thought that Greece could be the seed of something, new emerging. And I think that's really the time we're at in history, right? I think the right is not wasting this crisis. They're ratcheting downward expectations around freedom of movement across borders. They're ratcheting downward expectations around right to an education, right to a wage, right? All of this stuff is getting pushed down, and they're going to try and institutionalize these changes after this crisis lifts. And I think the job of people on the left is to try and ratchet this upwards, right? Try and demand that this is a moment for things to change and to change fundamentally. And I think that's really what we're going to be looking at unfolding. Hopefully we make it, right?
If I could jump in and say one thing about what Katherine had said about education. Think about it. The pandemic has closed basically all schools. I teach at a university. I've been informed that my class in the fall will have to be a distance class. The California state system, I understand, has declared that it will remain closed other than electronically in the fall. Others are following suit. You are cutting down, you're cutting back, you're undermining public education in the United States. And that's already now with more of these state budget cuts and local budget cuts. Catherine's right. It impacts education as always one of the biggest expenditures. Look, as a professor of economics, my profession tells our students that the number one determinant of the future of the United States and the world economy is the quality and the quantity of the people coming through our school system and becoming educated, trained, disciplined, skilled, whatever words you want, working people. And that's going to be where the creativity and the breakthroughs and the inventions come. We are therefore a society shooting ourselves in the foot. We are undermining our own future. Assuming Americans are as smart as the next population, I have to assume that this is a sign of a system that is now in full scale decline. It's revealed by being unprepared for the pandemic. It's revealed by allowing the economy to crash. Other countries didn't allow people to be laid off, and nothing like these numbers. The government came in and carried the salary indefinitely, et cetera, et cetera. There's ways of sharing unemployment. We're not exploring any of them. This is a system that is taking steps that are self-destructive, and that's usually a sign of fairly advanced mental, if not total, decline of an institution, of an organization, of an individual. I think we are seeing a system decline far beyond the particulars that we focus on from time to time.
Mm. Yeah, I saw some observations on social media talking about these Blue Angel flyovers, to show the medical professionals how much we appreciate them. And that is really the sign of an empire that is heading in downward direction, trying to flex this military might while everything else around it is completely in shambles. Gang, we are near the end of the hour, but Schultze 100, thank you, Schultze, from the comments, has a question here, and I want to get this in for the panel. Would reenacting Glass-Steagall to exactly what it was before Clinton repealed it, would this bring things back to normal? And if so, how do we bring that back into the political sphere? Any takers?
Well, I think it is true. Glass-Steagall, which the Banking Act back in 1933 was supposed to build a wall between investment banking and commercial banking so that the banking system would not take risks with other people's money that could come back to haunt us. And like most reforms in capitalism, the banking industry fought it. So did the business community. But because of the special times of the Great Depression, they lost and the bill got passed. Then what happens in capitalism is the people who lost understand, okay, now our job is to evade this law, to wither it down, to whittle it down, and eventually to repeat it. Took them 40 years, but thanks to Bill Clinton, they got it repealed at the end. He signed off on that. And 8 years later, we had the next crash of our commercial system. I don't know whether reinstating Glass-Steagall would be sufficient. Our credit system has got so many loopholes now. It is international. There's a whole shadow banking system, shadow credit system. Whether you can even get it under control without an international agreement of the sort that we are now further from than we've been in 30 years is very, very dubious. So I doubt that it's on the agenda. And my guess is we'll have sooner taken steps in the direction of Medicare for all, which is closer, as Katherine rightly said, than going for that kind of a struggle, which is so far beyond what is in the cards, at least as a possibility now.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think it would be a very good idea to reinstate those protections, but I don't think that would, we have so many problems that need to be addressed. I don't know that would be sufficient. I think it would be certainly a good step in terms of regulating the banking sector, but we have many, many issues at stake in this current crisis.
John,
Yeah,
where's your take on Glass-Steagall? Should we get a Glass-Steagall 2020? Is that in the cards? You think Joe Biden's going to sign off on a Glass-Steagall 2020 if he gets
Joe
elected to the
Biden,
White House?
noted, virulent enemy of the banking industry, right, and Wall Street. I don't. I would love to see it. I would love to see, all sorts of sensible regulations reenacted. I mean, we've been gutting regulations left and right, and even before Trump, and Trump has just been on a tear through, the entire rule book, rolling back regulations, rolling back regulators, making it all really, really hard to do the things that we tried to put in place to regulate this system and keep it operating within acceptable parameters. But I think the problem goes deeper than regulation. I think there's systemic rot at the heart of this system. And I don't think it's just a matter of, putting the guardrails back on capitalism so it behaves itself. I really think it's a matter of really going the extra mile and actually getting the systemic change we need. And that means that we got to think bigger than regulation.
Black Magic from the comments says, thank you, Real News, for getting this panel. I am excited to rewatch. And you're going to have to rewatch because we've come to the end of our hour. I would like for this conversation to go on further because I'm able to follow everything that y'all are saying. So thank you very much for putting all this in lay terms for us non-economic minded folks. But that means we're just going to have you guys on again because there's so much to cover. I mean, there's so many moving parts. This is not even close to being over. I don't even know if we're in the middle. I mean, geez, Christmas. So, but I don't want to hold everybody hostage. So I'm going to let the panel go with our thanks. Thank you so much, Richard Wolff, Katherine Moos, and John Duda. Well, you work here. I don't have to thank you. You're going to be here anyway. But thank you all for your wonderful insight and perspective. And thank y'all for making the time to talk with us.
Thank you as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kim.
And gang, you wasted another hour plus watching Stir Crazy. I hope you learned something. I did. I learned 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 things. I learned a lot of stuff. That's what you get when you watch the Real News Network. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and we'll see you tomorrow for another episode of Stir Crazy. You guys have a great evening.